The streetlight flickered in the dim alleyway, casting long, jagged shadows on the cracked concrete. The night air was thick with humidity, the scent of wet asphalt rising up from the cracks. A soft whimper echoed through the stillness, barely audible but undeniable. He was there. Huddled beneath a dumpster, his body curled in on itself, as if trying to protect the very soul he had left. His fur, once golden and proud, was matted with dirt and blood, the source of which was a horrifying, gaping wound that cleaved through his side. He was broken, in ways no living creature should ever be. The young woman knelt in front of him, the streetlight catching her tear-filled eyes. She had no idea how long he'd been lying there, abandoned. No idea who had left him to suffer, but she knew one thing: this would not be his end. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out, her fingers trembling, not just from fear, but from the weight of something far more powerful, the knowledge that she might be his only hope. Every heartbeat was louder than the next, echoing the fragility of life and death that hung between them. As her hand brushed against his coat, he flinched, but didn't pull away. He was alive, and in that moment, something inside her broke. This wasn't just a dog in pain. It was a soul reaching out, and it was desperate. It was the kind of night where the world felt muffled, like the hum of the city had been dimmed just enough to make the smallest sounds feel amplified. The streets were slick from an earlier downpour, and the air, thick with the scent of wet asphalt and decaying leaves, clung to everything. The only light came from a flickering street lamp that threw uneven shadows across the cracked pavement. In this forgotten corner of the city, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. She had been walking, lost in her own thoughts, when she heard it, a soft whimper, barely more than a breath against the night. Her heart skipped a beat, instinctively drawn to the sound. It wasn't a noise she could ignore. The city was full of echoes, but this one was different. It was raw. Desperate, she slowed her steps, straining her ears, and followed the sound down an alleyway where the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. There, beneath a dumpster, curled into a tight ball of pain, was the dog. Her first thought was that it was a stray, maybe one of the many abandoned pets that sometimes made the city their home. But as she got closer, her breath caught in her throat. The dog's fur, once golden and full of life, was now matted, clotted with dirt and blood. The deep gash on his side was the source of the blood, an open wound that sliced through his flesh, raw and unforgiving. The sight was enough to turn her stomach, but she couldn't look away. The dog was barely moving. His breathing was shallow, labored. His eyes, though full of pain, still seemed to hold something else, a flicker of hope, a glimmer of life still hanging on, though the world around him seemed indifferent. And in that moment, a fire ignited inside her. It was instinct, it was desperation, but it was also something deeper, something that told her that she could not leave him here. Not like this. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling, not just from the cold of the night, but from the weight of what she was about to do. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a healer. But she knew one thing: she couldn't leave this poor creature to die in this alley. Not alone. The dog flinched as her fingers grazed his fur, but he didn't pull away. His body was stiff, rigid with pain, but he trusted her enough not to fight back. That trust, fragile and fleeting, was all she needed to push past her fear. She gently scooped him up, wincing as his weight pressed against her chest. It felt like holding a piece of shattered glass, sharp and broken, yet still whole enough to make her hold on. Her heart hammered in her chest, louder than her footsteps, and she hurried toward the nearest vet clinic. The city streetlights blurred past her, but nothing seemed to matter anymore. She had to save him. As she reached the clinic, her pulse racing, she barely noticed the cool night air or the murmur of the traffic. The world had narrowed down to just one thing: this dog, this fragile, broken creature who needed her in ways she couldn't quite understand. Her mind raced with questions. Would he survive? Would she be able to save him? The doors of the clinic slid open with a soft chime, and the smell of antiseptic filled the air. It was sterile, clinical, and cold, a far cry from the warmth she'd just left behind. The vet rushed forward as soon as he saw them, his face serious, but there was no panic. Just a quiet professionalism that calmed her nerves for just a moment. "He's lucky you found him when you did," the vet murmured, his voice steady. He didn't look at her as if she had done something extraordinary. He only saw the patient in her arms. The dog's wound was severe, the blood having soaked through the ragged fur, and the vet went to work immediately. He cleaned the wound, his movements swift and practiced, but every action felt like a small eternity. The dog, though still trembling, didn't resist. The pain was too much for him to fight, and for the first time since she had found him, she allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't over yet, but he had a chance, a real chance, and that was all she needed to hold on to. For the next few hours, the clinic's sterile walls became a cocoon, a safe space where life could begin again. The vet stitched the wound closed, treating it with a tenderness that made her wonder if he had once been in the same position, vulnerable, fragile, clinging to life by the thinnest thread. She sat in the chair beside him, her eyes never leaving the dog as he lay on the table, too exhausted to do anything but rest. Her fingers itched to reach out and comfort him, but she knew better. He needed space, and more than that, he needed trust. The bond between them had started in that alleyway, in a moment of desperation. But now, it was deepening. She could feel it in the way he settled into the warmth of the blanket, in the way his breathing slowed more even now. He was going to be okay. He had to be. And as she sat there, the weight of the world outside falling away, she realized something. This wasn't just about rescuing a dog. It was about something bigger, something that reached deep into her own soul. There had been so much emptiness in her life, so much noise, but this moment was real. It was grounding. It was the first thing in a long time that made her feel like she wasn't alone. As the vet worked to finish his task, she let herself close her eyes just for a second, and when she opened them again, it was as if everything had shifted. The dog, the wounded soul who had trusted her in the darkest of times, had already begun his journey of healing, and with him so had she. The future was uncertain, and there were many hurdles to cross. But for now, in this sterile room filled with soft beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic, she knew one thing. She had saved him. She had given him a chance at life, and in doing so, he had given her a chance at something she hadn't realized she needed: hope. The clinic was quieter now, the beeping of machines the only sound that punctuated the stillness. Rufus, the dog she had found broken and bleeding in the alley, lay on the examination table, his bandaged side visible beneath the soft glow of the overhead light. The vet had done his work well, but there was something about seeing him this way, patched up, safe but still so vulnerable, that made her stomach tighten with worry. The fear of losing him, even now, clung to her like an invisible weight. She sat in the chair beside the table, watching him closely. His breathing had steadied, but his body was still trembling slightly, a silent reminder of the trauma he had endured. The thin blanket that covered him was no match for the cold that seemed to seep into the air from the sterile walls, but it was more than just temperature that made the room feel heavy. It was the sense of finality that loomed in the background. She had acted on instinct when she found him, but now, as he lay there, she couldn't help but wonder if she had done enough. The vet returned, a soft knock on the door before he entered. His face was unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes as he approached the table. He adjusted his glasses before speaking, his voice calm but firm. "He's stable for now, but we'll have to keep an eye on him," he said, glancing at the dog's side, where the bandages had been carefully applied. The wound was deep, and it might take some time for him to fully recover. "He's a fighter, though. You've given him a good shot." Her chest tightened with relief, though it was still tinged with a subtle edge of fear. She wanted to ask more questions, to know exactly how long the recovery would take, what signs to watch for, but the vet's words were enough. Rufus had survived the worst part, the shock, the trauma, the infection that might have set in had she not found him when she did. And now, it was a waiting game. She stood and walked over to Rufus, gently brushing her fingers against the top of his head. His fur was soft, though matted in places, still stained with dirt and blood. But underneath that, there was something familiar in the way he leaned into her touch. It was a moment that seemed almost too tender to be true. "You're going to make it, Rufus," she whispered to him, her voice soft, a promise made in the silence of the room. Her fingers traced the edge of his ear, and despite the vulnerability in his expression, something in his eyes seemed to soften, to accept her words. The bond that had been formed in the alleyway, broken, fragile, and uncertain, had begun to take root. It was as if, in that moment, he understood that he was no longer alone. He wasn't just a street dog left to suffer and die in an alley. He was here, in this clinic, in this moment, and he was going to survive, with her. but the emotional weight of that responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. It wasn't just about saving him anymore. It wasn't just about getting him through this moment, this night. The road ahead would be long. It would require patience, care, and a bond that would take time to build. She had never imagined what it would feel like to care for something so deeply, to invest so much of herself into another living being. But here she was, and she couldn't turn back. The vet's voice broke her from her thoughts. "We'll keep him overnight. We can monitor him, make sure the infection doesn't spread. I'd suggest that you keep an eye on him over the next few days. Check for any changes, but for now, he's in good hands." She nodded, though the words barely registered. She wasn't thinking about the vet or the clinic. She was thinking about Rufus, about what had brought him here, about the years he must have spent alone, abandoned, maybe hurt before. Her chest tightened as she watched him, breathing softly, his eyes closing in exhaustion. "You're safe now," she repeated, more to herself than to him. Hours passed and the clinic grew quieter as the night wore on. The vet had left her with Rufus, advising her to take the time to bond with him, to speak softly, to reassure him. The air was thick with the quiet hum of machines and the soft rustle of papers, but all she could hear was the sound of Rufus's breathing. It was rhythmic, steady now, though his body still flinched every so often, perhaps remembering the pain of what had happened to him. His ears flicked nervously at the slightest sound, but slowly his body relaxed beneath the blanket. She sat in the chair beside him, her fingers occasionally reaching out to stroke his fur, her mind still running through the details of what had happened. She had found him, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't done enough. The question lingered. What had caused the wound? Who had hurt him? It wasn't just a wound that came from a simple accident or a random fight. This was something deliberate, something cruel. He had been left for dead, and someone. But in this clinic, with the cold white walls and the sterile smell of antiseptic, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was safe. What mattered was that he wasn't alone anymore. As she sat there, the weight of the world lifting just slightly, a soft thought occurred to her. Rufus wasn't the only one who needed saving, and caring for him, she had realized that there was something broken inside of her too. Something that had been left in tatters for so long. Something that needed mending. And now here she was, holding this fragile creature in her arms, learning to heal, not just for him, but for herself. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, letting the stillness of the room wash over her. The weight of her breath, the rise and fall of Rufus's chest, filled her senses, grounding her in the moment. She didn't know what the future held, or how long it would take for him to fully recover. But right then, she felt a quiet peace. She had made the choice to save him, and that choice had created something more than just a rescue. It had created a new chapter for both of them. Rufus stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open, and for a brief, fragile moment, their gazes locked. There was trust there, just a glimmer, but it was enough to tell her that he too had begun to believe. He had been saved, and so had she. The days that followed Rufus's rescue were quieter, softer, as if time itself had slowed down to accommodate the fragile recovery of both dog and woman. The clinic, once filled with the frantic pace of medical staff and the sterile hum of machines, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where healing could happen without the rush of the world demanding attention. Every morning she returned to sit by his side, watching him sleep, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. It was a delicate process. Rufus's wound, though stitched closed, was still raw, and the tenderness of his body reminded her of how much more he had endured than anyone should. Yet, as she watched him every day, she saw something else. The slow unfurling of trust in his eyes, the gradual relaxation of his tense muscles when she spoke softly to him, the gentle nudge of his nose against her hand when he wanted attention. Each small moment was a victory. And with every passing day, her connection to him deepened. Just as his recovery progressed, his fur, once clumped together with dirt and dried blood, was slowly becoming softer. He was bathed, groomed, fed, and his body was slowly regaining its strength. But it wasn't just the physical healing that mattered. It was the healing of his spirit, the invisible wounds that ran deeper than the gash on his side. It was the trauma of abandonment, of betrayal, of being left to suffer without care. These were the scars he would carry with him long after the bandages had been removed. As she sat beside him one afternoon, Rufus's eyes fluttered open, and he let out a soft sigh, stretching his legs with a grunt. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting warm rays across the floor. She smiled, her fingers brushing through his fur, as if somehow reassuring him that the world had become a safer place. "You're doing so well," she whispered, the words almost too soft to hear. But Rufus seemed to understand. His tail, still unsteady, wagged faintly at the sound of her voice. It was a simple gesture, but to her, it was everything. It was a sign that he was beginning to trust her again, beginning to let go of the fear that had bound him to his painful past. But even as Rufus's body grew stronger, there were moments when she could see the vulnerabilities still lingering in his eyes. There were times when a sudden sound would make him flinch, or when the shadows in the corner of the room would cause him to startle, his body tensing in terror as if expecting the worst. The healing process wasn't linear. It was messy, uncertain, filled with setbacks. But that was what made the small victories so sweet. On one particular evening, as she sat next to him, holding his head gently in her lap, she found herself reflecting on her own life. It had always been a struggle, one way or another: work, family, her own sense of emptiness. But here, in this quiet room with this wounded creature by her side, she felt something she hadn't realized she was missing. It was peace. Not the kind that comes from external things, but the kind that arises when you commit yourself to something, when you give a part of yourself to something that requires care, patience, and love. She had seen him at his lowest, when he had been abandoned, broken, and bleeding, and she had made the choice to save him. But now, she realized that he had saved her too. She had been running for so long, from everything, from everyone, from herself. But now, as she looked down at Rufus, his eyes full of quiet trust, she understood. Healing wasn't something that just happened overnight. It took time. It took compassion. It took vulnerability. And sometimes it took the willingness to let go of the pain and trust that things could get better. She took a deep breath, the weight of everything she had been carrying lifting just a little. Rufus shifted in her lap, resting his head on her leg, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. A shared understanding, a bond that was growing stronger each day. As the days passed, Rufus's strength continued to build. The limp in his step was less noticeable now, though he still walked with caution, as though testing his own limits. But the playful glint in his eyes had returned. One evening, after a long walk in the park, he bounded back to the front door, his tail wagging excitedly. It was a transformation that both humbled and amazed her. He had come so far from the broken, fearful dog she had found in that alley, to this, a creature who could play, who could laugh with joy, and who could trust again. But it wasn't just Rufus who had healed. The process of caring for him, watching him recover, had forced her to confront parts of herself she had long ignored. Her own wounds, the ones she had buried deep beneath the surface, began to surface in subtle ways. It was almost as if caring for Rufus had given her permission to feel again. The emotional distance she had built between herself and the world began to dissolve, just as his fear had faded, just as his physical scars had started to heal. The journey wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, of frustration, and of pain. Rufus's scars, though less visible now, were still there, reminders of his past, reminders of the pain he had endured. But with each passing day, he grew stronger. And with each passing day, she found herself healing, too. One morning, as the sun began to rise and the soft light filled the room, Rufus stood at the window, his gaze fixed on the outside world. He hadn't been able to look out that window for weeks, too fearful of the world beyond the clinic, too uncertain of his place in it. But now he stood there, his eyes focused and calm, as if for the first time in a long while, he was ready to face the world. She joined him at the window, her hand resting lightly on his back. They stood together in silence, side by side, watching the day unfold before them. The world had seemed so vast, so frightening just a few weeks ago. But now it didn't feel so big. It felt manageable. It felt possible. "They're going to be okay," she whispered to him, her voice full of quiet certainty. "We're going to be okay." And in that moment, as the sun bathed them both in golden light, she realized that they had both found something. Something she hadn't even known she was looking for. A sense of peace, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward, one day at a time, together. It was inevitable. As much as she had prepared herself for this moment, as much as she had worked tirelessly to build trust in a routine, the test was coming. It wasn't just about Rufus's recovery anymore. It was about something deeper, something more fragile. It was about the unspoken bond between them, the trust that had slowly, painstakingly formed between the two of them. And now that bond would be tested in a way she hadn't anticipated. The morning was crisp, the air tinged with the first hints of autumn, and the trees outside their small home were starting to shed their leaves. It was a peaceful morning, almost too peaceful, she thought as she glanced at the clock on the wall. It had been a while since she had left the house for any reason. Her routine had become so entwined with Rufus's recovery that it was hard to imagine a day without him by her side. But now, there was no choice. She had a meeting that she couldn't reschedule. For the first time in weeks, she would be away from him. As she grabbed her coat and slipped into her shoes, Rufus followed her through the hallway, his paws clicking softly against the floor. He stopped at the door and looked up at her, his eyes wide, his body tense. She could see the anxiety in his posture, the way his tail drooped slightly, and the unease that lingered in the air. He had grown accustomed to her being there, to the comforting presence she provided. He had learned to trust again, but not yet enough to let go. Hey, buddy, she said softly, kneeling down to meet his gaze. She reached out to scratch behind his ears, but he pulled away slightly, as though anticipating her departure. His breath quickened, his eyes flickering nervously to the door. She swallowed the lump in her throat. She had prepared for this. She had been building up his trust, helping him feel safe. But she hadn't prepared herself for this raw, vulnerable moment. It wasn't just about leaving him for the first time. It was about confronting the possibility that, for all their progress, she might be leaving him in a place where his fears could return. "I'll be back soon, I promise," she whispered, her voice low, more for herself than for him. She hated the way her chest tightened at the thought of leaving him alone. Rufus's eyes followed her as she stepped toward the door, his paws barely making a sound as he stood frozen in place. She hesitated, reaching for the handle, and in that moment, a wave of guilt washed over her. Was she making a mistake? Was he ready for this? She took a deep breath, steeling herself, but just as she opened the door, the unmistakable sound of paws padding quickly toward her made her stop. Rufus had dashed forward, his tail now lowered, his eyes wide and frantic. He stopped just before the door, his body trembling with a fear that was all too familiar. She could see it in the way his head turned slightly to look at her. The panic, the sense of abandonment that flooded his heart in that brief moment. She knelt down again, her heart sinking as she saw him cower before her. His eyes searched hers, pleading. It was clear that leaving him alone was too much for him. This wasn't just separation anxiety. It was a deeply ingrained fear, a fear that had been buried under layers of trauma, of being left behind, ignored, and forgotten. For a long moment, she simply stared at him. Her mind raced, torn between the necessity of the meeting and the pain of seeing him in such distress. But it was then that she understood something. She couldn't fix everything. She couldn't heal every wound in a single day, no matter how much she wanted to. And while she couldn't bear to leave him feeling like this, she also knew that this moment, this fear of abandonment, was part of his healing. "I'm sorry, Rufus," she whispered, her voice breaking as she placed a hand on his trembling back. "I'm coming back. You're going to be okay." She stood slowly, her body feeling heavy as she walked out the door, but not before taking one last glance at his fearful eyes, his form silhouetted against the doorway. She knew the pain she felt wasn't just hers. It was his too. But in that moment, she had to trust that he would be okay, that this was another step in his recovery. The meeting went as planned, but every minute of it felt like 100 years. Her thoughts were consumed by Rufus, by the anxiety she had left behind, by the image of his trembling body, by the uncertainty of what he might do without her by his side. She forced herself to focus on the conversation at hand, but every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped. It was nearing the end of the meeting when her phone finally rang. Her pulse quickened as she saw the familiar number on the screen. It was her neighbor, the one who had agreed to check on Rufus during her absence. With trembling hands, she answered. "Hey, how's he doing?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "He's fine," the neighbor said, though there was a slight hesitation in their voice. "He was a little restless at first, but I gave him some treats and stayed with him for a while. He settled down and he's napping now. You've done a good job with him. He's a lot better than he was before." A small wave of relief washed over her, but it was bittersweet. Rufus had been alone, but he had also been okay. This moment, the separation, would eventually become part of his journey, a part of his growth. Just as he had learned to trust her, he would learn to trust himself again. When she returned home that afternoon, the door opened with a quiet creak, and she stepped inside, greeted immediately by the sound of paws padding on the floor. Rufus appeared from the hallway, his eyes wide, his body still tense but not in panic. When he saw her, his tail gave a tentative wag, as though unsure if it was safe to celebrate her return. She dropped to her knees, arms wide, and Rufus bounded toward her, his excitement mixed with a residual wariness. He stopped just before her, and for a moment they simply stared at one another. His eyes were still filled with that hint of fear, but there was something else there too, something that felt new, something that resembled the trust they had been building. And then, slowly, tentatively, he stepped into her embrace. "You did great, Rufus," she whispered, burying her face in his fur, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat against her chest. "We're getting there, one step at a time." The test had been difficult. It had pulled at every inch of her emotional strength, but it had also shown her something important. She had learned that her bond with Rufus wasn't just one of physical care. It was one that required vulnerability, trust, and the willingness to face the discomfort of change, both for her and for him. But they were moving forward. Together, and together they would find a way to heal. The seasons shifted quietly, as they always do. The cool, crisp air of autumn began to deepen into the chill of winter. Days grew shorter, and the first frost kissed the ground, covering the world in a quiet layer of white. But inside, where the warmth of the fire flickered in the hearth and the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, there was a sense of peace that neither of them had known before. Rufus, once broken and lost, now lay on his favorite spot on the rug, his body relaxed and his breathing steady. The scars that had marked his body and his soul had begun to heal, little by little. She looked at him often now, the dog who had become more than just a companion. He had become a mirror for her own journey, a reflection of the healing that was taking place within her as well. Every day with him was a small victory. Every quiet moment, every time he rested his head against her lap, every time he wagged his tail as he followed her from room to room. It was all a reminder that healing wasn't just about the absence of pain. It was about learning to live with it and still move forward. Rufus had grown strong. His limp was barely noticeable now, and his fur was shining with the health he had long been denied. His playful energy had returned, though still tempered by the caution that lingered beneath the surface. He was no longer the fearful, trembling dog she had found in that alleyway. But he was still learning to trust the world around him, still learning that not everything was a threat, still learning that he was worthy of love. She sat down beside him one evening, as the sun dipped low outside, casting the room in warm amber light. Rufus raised his head from the pillow, his eyes soft and alert, though not full of the anxiety that had once consumed him. He had come so far, but she knew that the healing was far from over, and neither of them was the same as they had been before. "You're my miracle, you know that?" she whispered, her fingers gently brushing his ear. "You've come so far, and I couldn't be prouder of you." Rufus blinked and gave a small, contented sigh, his body relaxing against her side. The bond between them, once fragile and uncertain, was now unbreakable. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the shadows of his past would catch him off guard. But he was no longer a prisoner to those shadows. He had learned to walk through them, to trust the light that had found him again, and so had she. The months of caring for him had given her a new sense of purpose, a renewed perspective on the things that mattered. She had been running for so long, running from her own pain, from her own fears, from the loneliness that had defined so much of her life. But Rufus had taught her something she hadn't expected to learn. He had taught her that healing wasn't linear, that sometimes you had to take a step back before you could move forward, and that love, even in its quietest, most unspoken forms, had the power to heal wounds that no one else could see. One crisp morning, as they took their usual walk through the park, she noticed Rufus sniffing the ground with his usual curiosity. His tail wagged with excitement as he followed the path, pausing every so often to investigate something that caught his attention. She watched him with a smile, her heart swelling with pride. It was a simple walk, a simple moment. But it was a milestone for both of them. Rufus was no longer just surviving. He was living, and so was she. As they reached the park bench, she sat down, letting the cool wind brush across her face. Rufus sat beside her, resting his head on her lap, his eyes soft and content. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of uncertainty that had followed her for so long. There was no more fear of abandonment, no more guilt over the past. There was only the present, the quiet, peaceful present where she could simply be with Rufus, where they could both take a deep breath and rest in the knowledge that they were safe. The journey to this moment had been long and difficult, filled with moments of fear, doubt, and loss. But it had also been filled with hope, with healing, and with love. They had both come so far. And though they didn't have all the answers, and probably never would, they knew one thing for sure. They were no longer alone. In the stillness of the park, surrounded by the rustling of leaves and the distant sounds of the world going on, they found something sacred, something that transcended their pain, their past, and all the things they had been running from. They had found each other. They had found a home. And in that home, there was a quiet understanding. Healing was not a destination. It was a journey, one that they would take together, one step at a time. As she watched Rufus curl up next to her, his eyes beginning to close in peaceful contentment, she whispered one last thing to him. "We're going to be okay, together." And in that moment, as the last of the daylight disappeared beyond the horizon, she felt a profound sense of peace settle in her heart. No matter what the future held, they had each other, and that was enough.